let's take a moment to reflect on the meaning of Eucharist during Lent. The elements of bread and wine at Jesus' Last Supper represent the cycle of death and resurrection. We don't have bread without cutting down the wheat, no wine without crushing the grape. And we know endings and beginnings in our bodies too. Our aging brings depth and wisdom. Our rest energizes us in new ways. Lent is a season known as bright sadness, a season of holy endings and new beginnings. In Lent, we make space for new life that surfaces after loss, the cycle of grief and celebration, which marks every change that we face. And we wonder, how can Jesus' way of peace live through us? So hear the story of the communion meal. Gathered around a table, Jesus took bread and having blessed it, broke the bread. Then Jesus gave it to his disciples saying, "This is my body and it is given for you. Eat it to remember me." And in the same way, Jesus took the wine and having given thanks, Jesus poured it out and gave the cup to the disciples saying, "This cup is a renewed relationship with God, sealed with my blood, my very life. Take it and share it." So here is your Eucharist invitation. Come when you are fearful to be made new in love. Come when you are doubtful to be made strong in faith. Come when you are regretful to be made whole. Come old and young. There is room for all. So let's take a quiet moment to reflect and to pray.
Today we have another sign. And it's a very familiar story that comes to us with a bit of a twist in the Gospel of John. And so we're going to talk today about redaction and lessons and loaves and power. Today we get to talk about something called redaction criticism. And redaction criticism is all about trying to understand what a writer is trying to say when they take on an existing story and they retell it in their own way. How we understand the point of our lives, that is a uniquely personal experience. One that reflects, I think, the unique way that Spirit interacts with each of us. So Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, so they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to the disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves that were left over by those who had already eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." But Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Matthew sees Jesus' miracle in response to a very real physical need. John sees this moment in response to a very real spiritual need. And I think this is fascinating. To understand, to recognize that the same moment can be more than one thing. Now, I know people who see everything through a spiritual lens. I know people who see their spirituality through a very practical lens. Truth is, that's probably me most of the time. And I know that some people find God in very experiential terms and others in more intellectual pursuits. But often I think part of our problem is that we spend too much of our time comparing how we experience God to how others describe their experience of God, rather than leaning into the divine that's all around us always. And if in the end God is truly love, then maybe the best thing that we can do is lean into the practices that help us become the most loving versions of ourselves, and whatever that is, we then search out and we name God in that for ourselves. And it reminds me that a single moment is never just a single thing. And that I can learn from what you see, that I can look back and I can see new things if I'm willing to. God is always speaking, and we can never exhaust God's grace. We can always look again. Now, all of the other gospel writers, they make a big deal about the meager rations that are available here, 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's kind of the magic of the moment, right? John is the only one to mention the type of bread on serve. I can appreciate John's attention to the doughy details here, 5 small barley loaves. However, this is not just a Johannine hobby poking through. This is part of John's telling. I think it has to do with the way that the crowd responds to this miraculous meal. The crowds are wowed not just by a free lunch, or even just by a miraculous meal. No, they are blown away by someone with this kind of miraculous power who would look after them, who would care for them after years of neglect and oppression. And so understandably, they say, this is the one that we want in charge by any means necessary. Except, Jesus doesn't see himself that way. Jesus sees himself in line with the prophets who spoke truth to power, not with the kings who wielded it. The sign of things to come is not just the miraculous bread. It's the image of one with infinite power who walks away from where we think power resides. And the great irony of that kind of story is that once we actually hear that welcoming voice in our lives, we slowly come to understand that is the only voice that is ever worth giving our allegiance to. Because the one that demands you bend the knee is not worth your respect. The one that invites you to come, that's the one we will all eventually bow before. And the king who eats with us rather than before us is the only one invested in what all of us truly need to flourish. May you see signs of things to come all around you this week. Gift and blessing and abundance and generosity, but more than that, might you begin to turn those things into a gift for someone else. And if that lesson comes to you as a spiritual recognition, a moment, or if you notice it in the work of justice and peace, then my prayer is that you trust that the way of God is welcome and never coercion, but is all around you all the time, inviting you into something more true. And one day, that story will shape the world to come.